So continuing our chapter 28 discussion, we'll talk about specific types of skull fractures now. Linear skull fractures really are the majority of the skull fractures that occur. They're not significantly displaced. Often you're going to have an x-ray to diagnose a linear skull fracture because there's no real definite signs that say that they're there. The patient, has pain, etc., but there's no true deformity to tell you that yes, there is a skull fracture. Depressed skull fractures. This is high energy direct trauma to a section of the head. This is going to be by blunt force, and it ends up pushing the skull in towards the brain. So you might be getting some bony fragments that actually go into the brain tissue itself, which can result in some injury. The frontal and parietal bones of the skull are definitely more susceptible. The picture shows the parietal bone, obviously. And then patients often present with neurologic signs, first and foremost. They may have like a loss of consciousness, massive headache, those sorts of things. And unless you're really feeling, or it's a massive depressed skull fracture, you're not going to see these unless you do a good, thorough assessment. Basilar skull fractures. So this is, again, high energy trauma, but this is typically going to occur because of diffuse spreading of that energy. So the depressed is more where it's super localized. Now, all of a sudden, if the skull as a whole ends up taking a decent amount of high energy, then it's going to blow out at the quote unquote weak spot, which would be the basilar portion of the skull. So these types of fractures can result from an extension of a linear fracture to the base of the skull, and they often are really hard to diagnose without an x-ray. Signs include CSF drainage either from the ears, can be from the nose as well. Raccoon eyes and that battle signs. Typically the battle signs is going to take a while to show up. And because this isn't a severe deforming type fracture, oftentimes our patients will think that they're okay, that they just have a headache, etc. And so they may wait to end up seeking medical care. So you may sometimes see that in your career, but more often than not, we won't necessarily see that so much in the field. And then open skull fractures, you've got typically enough energy that's been applied that there's several different areas on the body that will be affected. The massive complication with this is the potential for truly exposed brain tissue, brain matter, and its susceptibility to infection. There's a very high mortality rate, either due to the complications of swelling, the direct injury to the brain itself, or then the secondary complication of infection. Traumatic brain injuries. These are really the most serious of all of them. You're causing direct injury to the brain itself, not to the skull, not to the overlying structures, but legitimately to the brain itself. And so there's two different broad categories. You've got your primary or your direct injury, and then a secondary or indirect injury. Your primary brain injury is the direct result of the impact to the head. So that insulting injury is straight to the brain itself. Secondary generally is because of the side effects of that primary injury and is determined to be relative to the severity of that primary. So some things that cause secondary injuries. So cerebral edema, so that swelling in the brain can cause lack of oxygen, can cause blood pressure issues up within the brain, so you don't get as much perfusion as what you're supposed to. Intracranial hemorrhage, increased ICP, either from swelling or bleeding, cerebral ischemia, and then infection as well. When we're talking about brain injuries themselves, It can be from blunt or penetrating trauma, but we also have to keep in mind that there's a coup counter coup injury pattern. So what that means is that you initially take an impact on one portion of the brain, and then that's where you're going to find your primary, because it's going to come forward. Say if you hit your forehead on something, you're going to have an injury to the front portion of the brain as it slams into whatever object you've hit. The energy is going to be propulsed in that initial plane. But because there's not a whole lot of area to move around within your skull, what's going to then happen is that after it bounces off the first portion of the skull, it's going to move back in the other direction and hit the opposite portion of the brain as well. So if you're in a car crash, let's say, don't have your seatbelt on, you're going to go forward, hit your forehead on the windshield. So you're going to get that coup injury to the front portion of the brain. But as soon as it bounces off of your skull, it's going to come back and it's going to bounce off the back portion of your skull. Or it can be as your head bounces off of the windshield and it comes back and hits the headrest, then it's going to slam into the back part of the skull. So you actually have two areas of your brain that receive significant damage from one event. Your cerebral edema or swelling may not develop until several hours following that initial injury. So like I said, a lot of people may have a slight headache, whatever, which they expect, and then a couple of hours later they have significant deficit and somebody finally gets them the medical attention that they need. Intracranial pressure, this is an accumulation of blood within the skull or swelling of the brain that ends up increasing the overall pressure that's within the cranium. So what happens with that is that extra pressure ends up squeezing the brain against all of the bony prominences within the cranium because there's just not a whole heck of a lot of wiggle room, and it has to go somewhere. And so your brainstem ends up trying to come out the foramen magnum, and that's where all of your control centers are for all of your vital functions. And so it oftentimes ends up that there's going to be some sort of long-term deficit, if not death. Signs of increasing intracranial pressure. So abnormal respiratory patterns such as Biot or Cheyne-Stokes, and we did talk about those during respiratory. I would definitely suggest you getting on YouTube and looking up some of these different respiratory patterns, different respiratory sounds, so that you have the option to actually hear them. Decreased pulse rate, headache, nausea, vomiting, decreased alertness, bradycardia, sluggish. Bradycardia and decreased pulse rate are the exact same thing. I don't know why they have that in here twice. Loss of reactivity within the pupils, decebrate posturing, and increased or widening blood pressure. So decebrate is you have muscles that are tensing, but instead of coming in to protect the core, which is decorticate, they go the other way. And then the Cushing's reflex, this also is called the Cushing's triad. So this is an increase in systolic blood pressure, a decrease in the pulse rate, and irregular respirations. If you have all three of those are signs of impending herniation. Intracranial hemorrhage, this is bleeding that is inside the skull that causes an increase in intracranial pressure. The bleeding can either be between the skull and the dura mater, beneath the dura mater, but outside of the brain itself, or within the brain tissue itself. So basically, as long as it's beneath the skull, it's intracranial hemorrhage, okay, because it's cranium. An epidural hematoma is when you get an accumulation of blood between the skull and the dura mater. So that skull and the very first, very fibrous tissue that's covering the brain. Nearly always going to be the result of a blow to the head that creates a linear fracture and often going to be in that temporal bone. Some other things, it's typically going to be an arterial bleed that's going to result in rapidly progressing symptoms, often followed by a little bit of loss of consciousness. They lose consciousness because of the hit, and then they have an interval where they're pretty lucid, like they might have a headache, but they're with it, and then they progress very quickly into unconsciousness again, and they have to have surgery to evacuate the hematoma. Hematoma, remember, is a collection of blood. A subdural hematoma is an accumulation of blood beneath the dura mater, but it's still outside the physical brain tissue itself. It usually occurs after falls or some sort of strong deceleration type force. More common than epidural hematomas, but you don't necessarily have to have a skull fracture associated with this. A subdural hematoma is often venous bleeding, so signs typically develop way more gradually than that epidural, excuse me. Patients often exhibit various signs depending on how bad it is. So they may start out fully conscious, and then it continues to decrease, increasing amounts of slurred speech, but not as quickly progressing as what that epidural is. But they still need to be evaluated because there can be some pretty long-term effects of that. Intracerebral hematoma. So this is bleeding within the brain itself. So it can occur from a penetrating injury or a massive deceleration force. You end up with many like small, deep hemorrhages that are often associated with other brain injuries as well. Intracerebral hematomas have a very high mortality rate. Even if the hematoma is evacuated by a surgeon, they still tend to have some pretty massive consequences. And then your subarachnoid hemorrhage. So we talked about subdural, which is up above this portion, but now if we go down below that arachnoid, you end up getting a lot of bleeding into that subarachnoid space, and this is where your cerebral spinal fluid ends up circulating. So you can end up with some bloody cerebral spinal fluid, and then signs of meningeal irritation, so similar to those of meningitis. It's generally going to be a fair amount of trauma. Can be a ruptured aneurysm as well, but you end up getting a sudden severe headache, usually results in death. Survivors often have some sort of permanent neurologic impairment, but that's definitely not the one you want to have. Concussion, you may get this from a blow to the head or face. It is classified as a mild traumatic brain injury. It tends to be recoverable. It's a closed injury. You may have a temporary loss or alteration in the brain's ability to function, but you don't end up demonstrating physical damage to the brain itself. A good majority of the patients who sustain a concussion don't have a loss of consciousness. That's one of the questions that we ask, did you have a loss of consciousness? Patient may be confused, may have amnesia about the situation, but the concussion typically only lasts a short time. You want to ask about signs and symptoms of a concussion when they have them. Assume that any patient with signs and symptoms of a concussion definitely has a more serious injury until they have a CT scan or are evaluated by a physician to classify that or rule that out. We'll go ahead and stop here.